Chapter 5 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. What Miss Mary E. Proctor Did to Popularize Astronomy. "You can never know what your possibilities are," said Miss Proctor, "till you have put yourself to the test. There are many, many women who long to do something and could succeed if they would only banish their doubts and plunge in. For example, I was not at all sure that I could interest audiences with talks on astronomy, but in 1893 I began, and since then have given between 400 and 500 lectures. Miss Proctor is so busy spreading knowledge of the beauties and marvels of the heavens that she was at home in New York for only a 2 days' interval between tours when she consented to talk to me about her work. This talk showed such enthusiasm and whole-souled devotion to the theme that it is easy to understand Miss Proctor's success as a lecturer, though she is physically diminutive and is very domestic in her tastes. Audiences are appreciative. "I'm always nervous in going before an audience," she said, "but there is so much I want to tell them that I have no time at all to think of myself. I find that if the lecturer is really interested in the subject, those who come to listen usually are, and it is certainly true, as I have learned by going upon the platform, tired out from a long journey, that you cannot expect enthusiasm in your audience unless you are enthusiastic yourself. But I think that audiences are very responsive and appreciative of intelligent efforts to interest them, and therefore I am sure that if a woman possesses or can acquire a thorough knowledge of some practical, popular subject, and has enthusiasm and a fair knowledge of human nature, she can attain success on the lecture platform. The field is broad and far from overcrowded, and it yields bountifully to those who are willing to toil and wait. There is Miss Roberts, for instance, who commands large audiences for her lectures on music, and Mrs. Lemke, who has been remarkably successful in her practical talks on cooking, and Mary E. Booth, who gives wonderfully instructive and entertaining lectures on the revelations of the microscope, and Miss Veery, who takes audiences of children on most delightful and profitable imaginary trips to places of importance. Lectures to children. Children, by the way, are my most satisfactory audiences. Grown-up people never become so absorbed. It is the greatest pleasure of my lecturing to talk to the little tots and watch them drink it all in. Indeed, I prepared my very first lecture for children, but didn't deliver it. That episode marked the beginning of my career as a lecturer. Do you ask me to tell you about it? My father, Richard A. Proctor, wrote, as you know, many books on popular astronomy. When I was a girl, I did not read them very carefully, my education at South Kensington, London, following a musical and artistic direction. In fact, I was ambitious to become a painter. But when my father died in 1888, I found comfort in reading his books all over again, and as he had drilled me to write for his periodical, Knowledge, I began to write articles on astronomy for anyone who would accept them. One day, in the spring of 1893, I received a letter from Mrs. Potter Palmer asking me if I would talk to an audience of children in the Children's Building at the World's Fair. The idea of lecturing was new to me, but I decided that I would try at any rate, and so I took great pains to prepare a talk that I thought the children would understand and be interested in. But when I reached the building, I found an audience not of children, but of men and women. There was hardly a child in all the assembled 500 people. It would never do to give them the childish talk I had prepared, and as it was my first attempt to talk from a platform, you can imagine my state of mind. I was determined, however, that my first effort should not be a fiasco, so I stepped out upon the platform and talked about the things that had most interested me in my father's books and conversations. A lesson in lecturing. I have lectured a great many times since then, but my first lecture was the most trying. I am glad now that things happened as they did, for that experience taught me a valuable lesson. I learned not to commit my talks to memory, but merely to have the topics and facts and general arrangement of the lecture well in mind. By this method, I can change and adapt myself to my audience at any time, and I often have to do this. I am able to feel intuitively whether I have gained my listeners' sympathy and interest, and when I feel that I have not, I immediately take another tack. Another great advantage of not committing what you are going to say to memory, word for word, is the added colour and animation and spontaneity which the conversational tone and manner gives the lecture. The stereopticon. My stereopticon pictures of the heavenly bodies are of great help to me. They naturally add much to the interest and are really a revelation to most of my audiences, for the reason that they show things that can never be seen with the naked eye. How my father would have delighted in them, and how effectively he would have used them. But celestial photography had not been made practical at the time of his death. It is, indeed, quite a new art, although its general principles are very simple. A special lens and photographic plate are adjusted in the telescope, and the plate is exposed as in an ordinary camera, except that the exposure is much longer. It usually continues for about 4 hours. The greater the length of time, the greater being the number of stars that will be seen in the photograph. After the developing, these stars appear as mere specks on the plate. That they are so small is not surprising, for most of them are stars that have never been seen by the eye alone. When the photograph is enlarged by the stereopticon, the result is like looking at a considerable portion of the heavens through a powerful telescope. The children utter exclamations of delight when they see the pictures. The children, dear, imaginative little souls, it is my ambition to devote more and more of my time to them, and finally talk and write for them all together. They are greatly impressed with the new world in the skies which is open to them, and I like to think that these early impressions will give them an understanding and appreciation of the wonders of astronomy that will always be a pleasure to them. Stories from Starland. For the children, my first book, Stories from Starland, was written. I tried to weave into it poetical and romantic ideas that appeal to the imaginative mind of the child and quicken the interest without any sacrifice of accuracy in the facts with which I deal. I wrote the book in a week. The publisher came to me one Saturday and told me that he would like a children's book on astronomy. I devoted all my days to it till the following Saturday night, and on Monday morning took the completed manuscript to the publishing house. They seemed very much surprised that it should be finished so soon, but as a matter of fact it was not much more than the manual labour of writing out the manuscript that I did in that week. The little book itself is the result of 10 years' thought and study. It is much the same with my lectures. I deliver them in a hasty conversational tone, and they seem, as one of my listeners told me recently, to be just offhand chats. But in reality I devote a great deal of labour to them, and am constantly adding new facts and new ideas. Concentration of attention. I learned very soon after I began my work that I must give myself up to it absolutely if I were to achieve success. There could be no side issues, nothing else to absorb any of my energy or take any of my thought or time. One of the first things I did was to take a thorough course in singing, for the purpose of acquiring complete control of my voice. I put aside all social functions, of which I am rather fond, and have since devoted my days and nights to astronomy. Not that I work at night, except when I lecture. I rest and retire early, so that in the morning I may have the spirit and enthusiasm necessary to do good work. Enthusiasm, it seems to me, is an important factor in success. It combats discouragement, makes work a pleasure, and sacrifices easier. A great many women fail in special fields of endeavour, who might succeed if they were willing to sacrifice something and would not let the distractions creep in. There is more in a woman's life to divert her attention from a single purpose than in a man's, but if the woman has chosen some line of effort that is worthy to be called life work, and if, refusing to be drawn aside, she keeps her eyes steadfastly upon the goal, I believe that she is almost certain to achieve success. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. The boyhood experience of President Sherman of Cornell University. At 10 years of age, he was a country lad on a backwoods farm on Prince Edward Island. At 13, he had to become a clerk in a country store at a salary of $30 a year. At 18, he was a college student, supporting himself by working in the evenings as a bookkeeper. At 20, he had won a scholarship at the University of London in competition with all other Canadian students. At 25, he was a professor of philosophy at Acadia College, Nova Scotia. At 38, he was appointed president of Cornell University. At 44, he was chairman of President McKinley's Special Commission to the Philippines. In this summary is epitomized the career of Jacob Gould Sherman. It is a romance of real life such as is not unfamiliar in America. Mr. Sherman's career differs from that of some other self-made men, however. Instead of heaping up millions upon millions, he has applied his talents to winning the intellectual prizes of life, and has made his way unaided to the front rank of the leaders in thought and learning in this country. His career is a source of inspiration to all poor boys who have their own way to make in the world, for he has won his present honors by his own unaided efforts. President Sherman says of his early life, "It is impossible for the boy of today, no matter in what part of the country he is brought up, to appreciate the life of Prince Edward Island as it was 40 years ago. At that time it had neither railroads nor daily newspapers, nor any of the dozen other things that are the merest commonplaces nowadays, even to the boys of the country districts. I did not see a railroad until late in my teens. I was never inside a theater until after I was 20. The only newspaper that came to my father's house was a little provincial weekly. The only books the house contained were a few standard works such as the Bible, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Fox's Book of Martyrs, and a few others of that class. Remember, too, that this was not back in the beginning of the century, but little more than a generation ago, for I was born in the year 1854. My father had cleared away the land on which our house stood. He was a poor man, but no poorer than his neighbors. No amount of land, no amount of work could yield much more than the necessaries of life in that time and place. There were 8 children in our family, and there was work for all of us. A long tramp to school. Our parents were anxious to have their children acquire at least an elementary education, and so summer and winter we tramped the 1.5 miles that lay between our house and the district school. And the snow often fell to the depth of 5 or 6 feet on the island, and sometimes, when it was at its worst, our father would drive us all to school in a big sleigh. But no weather was bad enough to keep us away. That would be looked upon as a poor kind of school nowadays, I suppose. The scholars were of all ages, and everything, from A-B-C to the rule of 3, were taught by the one teacher. But whatever may have been its deficiencies, the work of the school was thorough. The teacher was an old-fashioned drill master, and whatever he drove into our heads he put there to stay. I went to the school until I was 13, and by that time I had learned to read and write and spell and figure with considerable accuracy. At the age of 13, I left home. I had formed no definite plans for the future. I merely wanted to get into a village and to earn some money. My father got me a place in the nearest town, Summerside, a village of about 1,000 inhabitants. For my first year's work, I was to receive $30 and my board. Think of that, young men of today. $30 a year for working from 7 in the morning until 10 at night. But I was glad to get the place. It was a start in the world, and the little village was like a city to my country eyes. He always supported himself. From the time I began working in the store until today, I have always supported myself, and during all the years of my boyhood I never received a penny that I did not earn myself. At the end of my first year I went to a larger store in the same town, where I was to receive $60 a year into my board. I kept this place for 2 years, and then I gave it up, against the wishes of my employer, because I had made up my mind that I wanted to get a better education. I determined to go to college. I did not know how I was going to do this, except that it must be by my own efforts. I had saved about $80 from my storekeeping, and that was all the money I had in the world. Out of $150, the only cash he received in his first earnings during 3 years, young Sherman had saved $80. This he invested in the beginning of an education. When I told my employer of my plan, he tried to dissuade me from it. He pointed out the difficulties in the way of my going to college, and offered to double my pay if I would stay in the store. The turning point of his life. That was the turning point of my life. On one side was the certainty of $120 a year, and the prospect of promotion as fast as I deserved it. Remember what $120 meant in Prince Edward Island, and to a poor boy who had never possessed such a sum in his life. On the other side was my hope of obtaining an education. I knew that it involved hard work and self-denial, and there was the possibility of failure in the end. But my mind was made up. I would not turn back. I need not say that I do not regret that early decision, although I think that I should have made a successful storekeeper. With my $80 capital, I began to attend the village high school to get my preparation for college. I had only 1 year to do it in. My money would not last longer than that. I recited in Latin, Greek, and algebra, all on the same day, and for the next 40 weeks I studied harder than I ever had before or have since. At the end of the year I entered the competitive examination for a scholarship in Prince of Wales College at Charlottetown on the island. I had small hope of winning it. My preparation had been so hasty and incomplete. But when the result was announced, I found I had not only won the scholarship from my county, but stood first in all the competitors on the island. The scholarship I had won amounted to only $60 a year. It seemed little enough, but I can say now, after nearly 30 years, that the winning of it was the greatest success I have ever had. I have had other rewards which, to most persons, would seem immeasurably greater, but with this difference, that first success was essential. Without it I could not have gone on. The others I could have done without, if it had been necessary. For 2 years young Sherman attended Prince of Wales College. He lived on his scholarship and what he could earn by keeping books for one of the town storekeepers, spending less than $100 during the entire college year. Afterwards he taught a country school for a year and then went to Acadia College in Nova Scotia to complete his college course. A splendid college record. One of Mr. Sherman's fellow students in Acadia says that he was remarkable chiefly for taking every prize to which he was eligible. In his senior year, he learned of a scholarship in the University of London to be competed for by the students of Canadian colleges. The scholarship paid $500 a year for 3 years. The young student in Acadia was ambitious to continue his studies in England and saw in this offer his opportunity. He tried the examination and won the prize. During the 3 years in the University of London, Mr. Sherman became deeply interested in the study of philosophy and decided that he had found in it his life work. He was eager to go to Germany and study under the great leaders of philosophic thought. A way was opened for him through the offer of the Hibbard Society in London, the prize being a traveling fellowship with $2,000 a year. The honor men of the great English universities like Oxford and Cambridge were among the competitors, but the poor country boy from Prince Edward Island was again successful, greatly to the surprise of the others. At the end of his course in Germany, Mr. Sherman, then a doctor of philosophy, returned to Acadia College to become a teacher there. Soon afterwards he was called to Dalhousie University at Halifax, Nova Scotia. In 1886, when a chair of philosophy was established at Cornell, President White, who once met the brilliant young Canadian, called him to that position. 2 years later, Dr. Sherman became Dean of the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell, and in 1892, when the President's chair became vacant, he was placed at the head of the great university. At that time, he was only 38 years of age. President Sherman is a man of great intellectual power and an inspiring presence. Though one of the youngest college presidents in the country, he is one of the most successful, and under his leadership, Cornell has been very prosperous. He is deeply interested in all the affairs of young men, and especially those who, as he did, must make their own way in the world. He said the other day, "Though I am no longer engaged directly in teaching, I should think my work a failure if I did not feel that my influence on the young men with whom I come in contact is as direct and helpful as that of a teacher could be." End of chapter 6.
Section 7 of How They Succeeded. This is a LibriVox recording. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Section 7. The Story of John Wanamaker. In a plain 2-story dwelling on the outskirts of Philadelphia, the future merchant prince was born, July 11, 1837. His parents were Americans in humble station, his mother being of that sturdy Pennsylvania Dutch stock which has no parallel except the Scotch for ruggedness. His father, a hard-working man, owned a brickyard in the close vicinity of the family residence. Little John earned his first money, 7 big copper cents, by assisting his father. He was too small to do much, but turned the bricks every morning as they lay drying in the summer sun. As he grew older and stronger, the boy was given harder tasks around the brickyard. He went to school a little, not much, and he assisted his mother in the house a great deal. His father died when John was 14, and this changed the whole course of his life. He abandoned the brickyard and secured a place in a bookstore owned by Barclay Lippincott on Market Street, Philadelphia, at a salary of $1.25 a week. It was a 4-mile walk from his home to his place of business. Cheerfully, he trudged this distance morning and night, purchasing an apple or a roll each noon for luncheon, and giving his mother all the money that he saved. He used to deny himself every comfort, and the only other money that he ever spent was on books for his mother. This seems to have been the boy's chief source of pleasure at that period. Even today, he says of his mother, "Her smile was a bit of heaven, and it never faded out of her face till her dying day. Mrs. Wanamaker lived to see her son famous and wealthy. His capital at 14. John Wanamaker the boy had no single thing in all his surroundings to give him an advantage over any one of hundreds of other boys in the city of Philadelphia. Indeed, there were hundreds and hundreds of other boys of his own age for whom anyone would have felt safe in prophesying a more notable career. His capital was not in money. Very few boys in all that great city had less money than John Wanamaker, and comparatively few families of average position but were better off in the way of worldly goods. John Wanamaker's capital, that stood him in such good stead in after life, comprised good health, good habits, a clean mind, thrift in money matters, and tireless devotion to whatever he thought to be duty. People who were well acquainted with John Wanamaker when he was a book publisher's boy say that he was exceptionally promising as a boy, that he was studious as well as attentive to business. He did not take kindly to rough play, or do much playing of any kind. He was earnest in his work, unusually earnest for a boy, and he was saving of his money. When, a little later, he went to a Market Street clothing house and asked for a place, he had no difficulty in getting it, nor had he any trouble in holding it, and here he could earn 25 cents a week more wages. Tower Hall Clothing Store. Men who worked with him in the Tower Hall clothing store say that he was always bright, willing, accommodating, and very seldom out of temper. His effort was to be first at the store in the morning, and he was very likely to be one of the last, if not the last, at the store in the evening. If there was an errand, he was always prompt and glad to do it, and so the store people liked him, and the proprietor liked him, and when he began to sell clothing, the customers liked him. He was considerate of their interest. He did not try to force undesirable goods upon them. He treated them so that when they came again, they would be apt to ask, "Where is John?" His ambition and power as an organizer at 16. Colonel Bennett, the proprietor of Tower Hall, said of him at this time, "John was certainly the most ambitious boy I ever saw. I used to take him to lunch with me, and he used to tell me how he was going to be a great merchant. He was very much interested in the temperance cause, and had not been with me long before he persuaded most of the employees in the store to join the temperance society, to which he belonged. He was always organizing something. He seemed to be a natural-born organizer. This faculty is largely accountable for his great success in life." The Y.M.C.A. Young Wanamaker's religious principles were always at the forefront in whatever he did. His interest in Sunday school work and his skill as an organizer became well known, and so earnestly did he engage in the work of the Young Men's Christian Association that he was appointed the first salaried secretary of the Philadelphia branch at $1,000 a year. Never since has a secretary enrolled so many members in the same span of time. He passed 7 years in this arduous work. Oak Hall. He saved his money and, at 24, formed a partnership with his brother-in-law, Nathan Brown, and opened Oak Hall Clothing Store in April 1861. Their united capital was only $3,500, yet Wanamaker's capital of popular goodwill was very great. He was already a great power in the city. I can never forget the impression made upon my mind after he had been in business but a few months, when I visited his Bethany's Sunday School, established in one of the most unpromising sections of the city, which had become already a factor for good, with one of the largest enrollments in the world, and he was foremost in every form of philanthropic work. It was because of this great capacity to do business that Wanamaker had been able to boom the Young Men's Christian Association work. He knew how to do it, and he could boom a Sunday school or anything else that he took hold of. He had a head built for business, whatever the business might be, and as for Oak Hall, he knew just what to do with it. The first thing he did was to multiply his working capital by getting the best help attainable for running the store. At the very outset, John Wanamaker did what almost any other businessman would have stood aghast at. He chose the best man he knew as a salesman in the clothing business in Philadelphia, the man of the most winning personality who could attract trade, and agreed to pay him $1,350 for a year, 1/3 of the entire capital of the new concern. It has been a prime principle with this merchant prince not only to deal fairly with his employees, but to make it an object for them to earn money for him and to stand by him. Capacity has been the first demand. He engaged the very best men to be had. There are today dozens of men in his employ who receive larger salaries than are paid to cabinet ministers. All the employees of the 13th Street store, which he occupied in 1877, participate in a yearly division of profits. Their share at the end of the first year amounted to $109,439.68. His relation to customers. A considerable portion of the trade of the new store came from people in the country districts. Mr. Wanamaker had a way of getting close to them and gaining their goodwill. He understood human nature. He put his customers at ease. He showed interest in the things that interested the farmer. An old employee of the firm says, John used to put a lot of chestnuts in his pocket along in the fall and winter, and when he had one of those countrymen in tow, he'd slip a few of the nuts into the visitor's hand, and both would go munching about the store. Wanamaker was the first to introduce the one-price system into the clothing trade. It was the universal rule in those days, in the clothing trade, not to mark the prices plainly on the goods that were for sale. Within rather liberal bounds, the salesman got what he could from the customer. Mr. Wanamaker, after a time, instituted at Oak Hall the plan of but one price, and that plainly marked. In doing this, he followed the cue of Stewart, who was the first merchant in the country to introduce it into the dry goods business. The great Wanamaker store of 1877 went much further. He announced that those who bought goods of him were to be satisfied with what they bought or have their money back. To the old mercantile houses of the city, this seemed like committing business suicide. It was also unheard of that special effort should be made to add to the comfort of visitors, to make them welcome whether they cared to buy or not, to induce them to look upon the store as a meeting place, a rendezvous, a resting place, a sort of city home almost. The merchants' organizing faculty was so great that General Grant once remarked to George W. Childs that Wanamaker would have been a great general if his lot had been that of army service. Wanamaker used to buy goods at Stewart, and the New York merchant remarked to a friend, "If young Wanamaker lives, he will be a greater merchant than I ever was." Sometime in recent years, since Wanamaker bought the Stewart store, he said to Frank G. Carpenter, A.T. Stewart was a genius. I have been surprised again and again as I have gone through the Broadway and 10th Street building to find what a knowledge he had of the needs of a mercantile establishment. Mr. Stewart put up a building which is today, I believe, better arranged than any of the modern structures. He seemed to know just what was needed. I met him often when I was a young man. I have reason to think that he took a liking to me. One day, I remember, I was in his woolen department buying some stuffs from my store here, when he came up to me and asked if I would be in the store for 15 minutes longer. I replied that I would. At the end of 15 minutes, he returned and handed me a slip of paper saying, "Young man, I understand that you have a mission school in Philadelphia. Use that for it." Before I could reply, he had left. I looked down at the slip of paper. It was a check for $1,000. Wanamaker early showed himself the peer of the greatest merchants. He created the combination of department store. He lifted the retail clothing business to a higher plane than it had ever before reached. In 10 years from the time he began to do business for himself, he had absorbed the space of 45 other tenants and became the leading merchant of his native city. 4 years later, he had purchased for $450,000 the freight depot of the Pennsylvania Railroad, covering the entire square where his present great store is located. The firm name became simply John Wanamaker. His lieutenants and business partners therein are his son Thomas B. Wanamaker and Robert C. Ogden. Their 2 Philadelphia establishments alone do a business of between $30 million and $40 million annually. Mr. Wanamaker's private fortune is one of the most substantial in America. Attention to detail. Yet in all these years, he has been early and late at the store, as he was when a boy. He has always seen to it that customers have prompt and careful attention. He early made the rule that if a sale was missed, a written reason must be rendered by the salesman. There was no haphazard business in that store, nothing of that happy-go-lucky style. Each man must be alert, wide awake, attentive, or there was no place for him at Oak Hall. The most rigid economy has been always a part of the system. It is told of him that, in the earlier days of Oak Hall, he used to gather up the short pieces of string that came in on parcels, make them into a bunch, and see that they were used when bundles were to be tied. He also had a habit of smoothing out old newspapers and seeing that they were used as wrappers for such things as did not require a better grade of paper. The story has often been related of the first day's business at the original store in '61, when Wanamaker delivered the sales by wheeling a pushcart. Advertising. The first day's business made a cash profit of $38, and the whole sum was invested in one advertisement in the next day's Inquirer. His advertising methods were unique. He paid for the best talent he could get in this line. Philadelphia woke one morning to find W&B in the form of 6-inch square posters stuck up all over the town. There was not another letter, no hint, just W&B. Such things are common enough now, but then the whole city was soon talking and wondering what this sign meant. After a few days, a second poster modestly stated that Wanamaker and Brown had begun to sell clothing at Oak Hall. Before long, there were great signs, each 100 feet in length, painted on special fences, built in a dozen places about the city, particularly near the railroad stations. These told of the new firm and were the first of a class that is now seen all over the country. Afterwards, Balloons more than 20 feet high were sent up, and a suit of clothes was given to each person who brought one of them back. Whole counties were stirred up by the balloons. It was grand advertising, imitated since by all sorts of people. When the balloon idea struck the Oak Hall management, it was quickly found that the only way to get these airships was to make them. And so, on the roof of the store, the cotton cloth was cut and oiled and put together, being well built and tied very tightly at the neck. They made long flights, and some of them were used over and over again. In one instance, a balloon remained for more than 6 months in a cranberry swamp, and when the great bag was discovered, slowly swaying in the breeze among the bushes, the frightened Jerseymen thought they had come upon an elephant, or maybe a survivor of the mastodons. This made more advertising of the very best kind for the clothing store, the kind that excites interested complimentary talk. Seizing opportunities. Genius consists in taking advantage of opportunities quite as much as in making them. Here was a young man doing things in an advertising way, regardless of the custom of the business world, and with a wonderful knowledge of human nature. He took common sense advantage of opportunities that were open to everybody. Soon after the balloon experience, tally-ho! Coaching began to be a Philadelphia fad of the very exclusives. Immediately afterward, a crack coach was secured, and 6 large and spirited horses were used instead of 4, and Oak Hall employees dressed in the style of the most ultra-coaching set traversed the country in every direction, scattering advertising matter to the music of the horn. Sometimes they would be a week on a trip. No wonder Oak Hall flourished. It was kept in the very front of the procession all the time. A little later, in the yachting season, the whole town was attracted and amused by processions of scatterings of men, each wearing a wire body frame that supported a thin staff from which waved a wooden burgee or pointed flag, reminding them of Oak Hall. Nearly 200 of these prototypes of the Sandwich Men were often out at one time. But it was not only in the quick catching of a novel advertising thought that the new house was making history. In newspaper advertising, it was even further in advance. The statements of store news were crisp and unhackneyed, and the first artistic illustrations ever put into advertisements were used there. So high was the grade of this picture work that art schools regularly clipped the illustrations as models, and the world-famous Shakespearean scholar Dr. Horace Howard Furness treasured the original sketches of the 7 Ages as among the most interesting in his unique collection. Push and persistence. The chief reason, said Mr. Wanamaker upon one occasion, that everybody is not successful is the fact that they have not enough persistency. I always advise young men who write me on the subject to do one thing well, throwing all their energies into it. To his employees he once said, "We are very foolish people if we shut our ears and eyes to what other people are doing. I often pick up things from strangers. As you go along, pick up suggestions here and there, jot them down, and send them along. Even writing them down helps to concentrate your mind on that part of the work. You need not be afraid of overstepping the mark. The more we push each other, the better." To what, Mr. Wanamaker, do you attribute your great success? In reply to this question, when asked, he replied, "To thinking, toiling, trying, and trusting in God." A serene confidence in a guiding power has always been one of the Wanamaker characteristics. He is always calm, under the greatest stress, he never loses his head. In one physical particular, Mr. Wanamaker is very remarkable. He can work continually for a long time without sleep and without evidence of strain, and make up for it by a good rest afterwards. When upon one occasion he was asked to name the essentials of success, he replied curtly, "I might write a volume trying to tell you how to succeed. One way is to not be above taking a hint from a master. I don't care to tell why I succeeded, because I object to talking about myself. It isn't modest." A feature of his makeup that has contributed largely to his success is his ability to concentrate his thoughts. No matter how trivial the subject brought before him, he takes it up with the appearance of one who has nothing else on his mind. His views on business. When asked whether the small tradesman has any show today against the great department stores, he said, "All of the great stores were small at one time. Small stores will keep on developing into big ones. You wouldn't expect a man to put an iron band about his business in order to prevent expansion, would you? There are, according to statistics, a greater number of prosperous small stores in the city than ever before. What better proof do you want? The department store is a natural product, evolved from conditions that exist as a result of fixed trade laws. Executive capacity combined with command of capital finds opportunity in these conditions, which are harmonious with the irresistible determination of the producer to meet the consumer directly, and of merchandise to find distribution along the lines of least resistance. Reduce prices, stimulate consumption, and increase employment, and it is sound opinion that the increased employment created by the department stores goes to women without curtailing that of men. In general, it may be stated that large retail stores have shortened the hours of labor, and by a systematic discipline have made it lighter. The small store is harder upon the salesperson and clerk. The effects upon the character and capacity of the employees are good. A well-ordered modern retail store is the means of education in spelling, writing, English language, system, and method. Thus, it becomes to the ambitious and serious employee in a small way a university, in which character is broadened by intelligent instruction practically applied. When asked if a man with means but no experience would be safe in embarking in a mercantile business, he replied quickly, "A man can't drive a horse who has never seen one. No, a man must have training, must know how to buy and sell. Only experience teaches that." I have heard people marvel at the unbroken upward course of Mr. Wanamaker's career and lament that they so often make mistakes. But hear him. Who does not make mistakes? Why, if I were to think only of the mistakes I have made, I should be miserable indeed. I have heard it said 100 times that Mr. Wanamaker started when success was easy. Here is what he says himself about it. "I think I could succeed as well now as in the past. It seems to me that the conditions of today are even more favorable to success than when I was a boy. There are better facilities for doing business and more business to be done. Information in the shape of books and newspapers is now in the reach of all, and the young man has 2 opportunities where he formerly had 1. We are much more afraid of combinations of capital than we have any reason for being. Competition regulates everything of that kind. No organization can make immense profits for any length of time without its field soon swarming with competitors. It requires brain and muscle to manage any kind of business. and the same elements which have produced business success in the past will produce it now and will always produce it. Public service. With the exception of his term of service as Postmaster General of the United States in President Harrison's cabinet, a service which was marked by great executive ability and the institution of many reforms, Mr. Wanamaker has devoted his attention almost entirely to his business and his church work. Yet, as a citizen, he has always taken a most positive course in opposition to the evils that threaten society. He has been forever prompted by his religious convictions to pursue vice either in the dive or in municipal state or in national life. He hates a barroom, but he hates a treasury looter far more fiercely. His idea of Christian duty was evidently derived from the scene wherein the master took a scourge and drove the corrupt traders and office holders out of the temple. It is vigorous, it is militant, but it makes enemies. Consequently, Mr. Wanamaker is not without persistent maligners, getting himself well hated by the worst men in the community. Invest in yourself. Mr. Wanamaker's views on what life is for all are well expressed in the following excerpt from one of his addresses to young men. In the course of his address, he related that he was once called upon to invest in an expedition to recover Spanish mahogany and doubloons from the Spanish Main, which for half a century had lain under the rolling waves in sunken frigates. But, young men, he continued, I know of better expeditions than this right at home, deep down under the sea of neglect and ignorance and discouragement. Near your own feet lie treasures untold, and you can have them all for your own by earnest watch and faithful study and proper care. Let us not be content to mine the most coal, make the largest locomotives, and weave the largest quantities of carpets, but amid the sounds of the pick, the blows of the hammer, the rattle of the looms, and the roar of the machinery, take care that the immortal mechanism of God's own hand, the mind, is still full trained for the highest and noblest service. This is the most enduring kind of property to acquire, a property of soul which no disaster can wreck or ruin. Whatever may be the changes that shall sweep over our fair land, no power can ever take away from you your investment in knowledge. At home. Like all other magnetic and forceful men, Mr. Wanamaker is striking in his appearance, strong rather than handsome. He has a full round head, a broad forehead, a strong nose, heavy-lidded eyes that flash with energy, heavy jaws that denote strength of will, and tight-closed lips that just droop at the corners, giving an ever-present touch of sedateness. His face is as smooth as a boy's and as mobile as an actor's, and when lightened up in discussion, it beams with expression. He wears a hat that is only 6 7/8 in size, but is almost completely circular in form. He is almost 6 feet tall and finely built, and all his motions have in them the springiness of health. Nobody ever saw him dressed in any other color than black, with a black necktie under a turned-down collar, but he always looks as trim as if he were just out of the hands of both tailor and barber. It is his delight to pass much time at his country seat in Jenkintown. He is fond of the field and the river, the trees and flowers and all the growths with which God has beautified the earth. His house is a home-like structure, with wide piazzas standing upon the crest of a hill in the midst of a noble lawn. A big rosary and orchid house stand nearby. The before-breakfast ramble of the proprietor is finished in the flower garden, and every guest is laden with floral trophies. Mr. Wanamaker was married while he was the secretary of the YMCA to one whom he met at a church service, and who has been in full sympathy with his religious activities. He has been for 40 years superintendent of the Bethany Sunday School in Philadelphia. He began with 2 teachers and 27 pupils, and at the recent anniversary reported a school of 4,500, a church with 3,700 members, 500 having been added during the past year, several branches and scores of department organizations. John Wanamaker says today that his business success is due to his religious training. He is first of all a Christian. The lessons of such a life should be precious to every young man. It teaches the value of untiring effort, of economy, of common sense applied to common business. I know of no career in this country that offers more encouragement to young people. It shows what persistency can do. It shows what intelligent, well-directed, tireless effort can do, and it proves that a man may devote himself to helping others, to the Sunday school, to the church, to broad philanthropy, and still be wonderfully successful in a business way. End of section 7.
Chapter 8 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 8. Giving up $5,000 a year to become a sculptor. My life? Queried F. Wellington Ruckstuhl, one of the foremost sculptors of America, as we sat in his studio looking up at his huge figure of force. When did I begin to sculpture? As a kid, I was forever whittling, but I did not have dreams then of becoming a sculptor. It was not till I was 32 years of age, and love, disappointment in my first love, played a prominent part. But as a boy, Mr. Ruckstuhl, I was a poet. Every sculptor or artist is necessarily a poet. I was always reaching out and seeking the beautiful. My father was a foreman in a St. Louis machine shop. He came to this country in a sailing ship from Alsace, by way of the Gulf to St. Louis when I was but 6 years old. He was a very pious man and a deacon in a church. One time, Moody and Sankey came to town, and my father made me attend the meetings. I think he hoped that I would become a minister. Between the ages of 14 and 19, I worked in a photographic supply store, wrote 100 poems, and read incessantly. I enlarged a view of the statue of Nelson in Trafalgar Square, London, into a plaster sketch, 10 times as large as the picture, but still I did not know my path. I began a study of philosophy, and kept up my reading for 10 years. My friends thought I would become a literary man. I wrote for the papers and belonged to a prominent literary club. I tried to analyze myself. I am a man, I said, but what am I good for? What am I to make of this life? I drifted from one position to another. Every one was sorry to part with my services, for I always did my duties as well as they could be done. When I was 25 years of age, the girl to whom I was attached was forced by her mother to marry a wealthy man. She died a year afterwards, and I pulled up stakes and started on a haphazard, reckless career. I went to Colorado, drifted into Arizona, prospected, mined, and worked on a ranch. I went to California, and at one time thought of shipping for China. My experiences would fill a book. Again I reached St. Louis. For a year I could not find a thing to do, and became desperate. And you had done nothing at art so far? I asked. At that time I saw a clay sketch. I said to myself, I can do as well as that, and copied it. My second sketch admitted me to the St. Louis Sketch Club. I told my friends that I would be a sculptor. They laughed and ridiculed me. I had secured a position in a store, and at all times worked at what I had always loved, but had only half realized it. Notices appeared in the papers about me, for I was popular in the community. I entered the competition for a statue of General Frank R. Blair. I received the first prize, but when the committee discovered that I was only a bill clerk in a store, they argued that I was not competent to carry out the work, although I was given the first prize model and the $150 accompanying it. But that inspired you? Yes. But my father and mother put every obstacle in the way possible. I was driven from room to room. I was not even allowed to work in the attic. Here Mr. Rockstrol laughed. You see what genius has to contend with. I was advanced in position in the store till I became assistant manager at $2,000 a year. When I told the proprietor that I had decided to be a sculptor, he gazed at me in blank astonishment. A sculptor? He queried, incredulously, and made a few very discouraging remarks, emphasized with dashes. Why, young man, are you going to throw up the chance of a lifetime? I will give you $5,000 a year and promote you to be manager if you will remain with me. But I had found my life's work, said Mr. Rockstall, turning to me. I knew it would be a struggle through poverty till I attained fame, but I was confident in myself, which is half the battle. And you went abroad? Yes, with but $250, he replied. I traveled through Europe for 5 months and visited the French Salon. I said to myself, I can do that, and my confidence grew. But there was some work that completely beat me. I returned to America penniless, but with a greater insight into art. I determined that I would retrace my steps to Paris and study there for 3 years, and thought that would be sufficient to fully develop me. My family and friends laughed me to scorn, and I was discouraged by everyone. In 4 months, in St. Louis, I secured 7 orders for busts, at $200 each, to be done after my return from France. That shows that some persons had confidence in me, and in my talent. Oh, the student life in Paris! How I look back with pleasure upon those struggling yet happy days! In 2 months I started on my female figure of evening, in the nude, that is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I finished it in 9 months and positively sweat blood in my work. I sent it to the Salon and went to Italy. When I returned to Paris, I saw my name in the paper with honorable mention. I suppose you can realize my feelings. I experienced the first flush of victory. I brought it to America and exposed it in St. Louis. Strange to say, I rose in the estimation of even my family. My father actually congratulated me. A wealthy man in St. Louis gave me $3,000 to have my evening put into marble. I returned with it to Paris, and in a month and a quarter it was exhibited in the Salon. At the World's Fair at Chicago it had the place of honor, and received one of the 11 grand medals given to American sculptors. In 1892 I came to New York. This statue of force will be erected with my statue of wisdom on the new Court of Appeals in New York. We gazed at it, seated and clothed in partial armor of the old Roman type and holding a sword across its knees. The great muscles spoke of strength and force, and yet, with it all, there was an almost benign look upon the military visage. There is force and real action therewithal, although there is repose, I said in admiration. Oh, said Mr. Rockstall, that's it, and that is what is so hard to get. That is what every sculptor strives for, and, unless he attains it, his work, from my point of view, is worthless. There must be life in a statue. It must almost breathe. In repose there must be dormant action that speaks for itself. Is most of your work done under inspiration? I asked. There is nothing, and a great deal, in so-called inspiration. I firmly believe that we mortals are simply tools, mediums at work here on earth. I peg away and bend all my energies to my task. I simply accomplish nothing. Suddenly, after considerable preparatory toil, the mist clears away, and I see things clearly. Everything is outlined for me. I believe there is a conscious and a subconscious mind. The subconscious mind is the one that does original work. It cannot be affected by the mind that is conscious to all our petty environments. When the conscious mind is lulled and silenced, the subconscious one begins to work. That I call inspiration. Are you ever discouraged? I asked out of curiosity. Continually, replied Mr. Ruckstuhl, looking down at his hands, soiled with the working clay. Some days I will be satisfied with what I have done. It will strike me as simply fine. I will be as happy as a bird and leave simply joyous. The following morning, when the cloths are removed, I look at my previous toil and consider it vile. I ask myself, are you a sculptor or not? Do you think that you ever will be one? Do you consider that art? So it is, till your task is accomplished. You are your own critic, and are continually distressed by your inability to create your ideals. Mr. F. Wellington Ruckstuhl is 46 years of age, neither short nor tall, a brilliant man, with wonderful powers of endurance, for his work is more exacting and tedious than is generally supposed. I have simply worked a month and a quarter on that statue, he said. Certain work dissatisfied me, and I obliterated it. I have raised that head 3 times. My eyes get weary, and I become physically tired. On such occasions I sit down and smoke a little to distract my thoughts, and to clear my mind. Then my subconscious mind comes into play again, he concluded with a smile. Mr. Ruckstuhl's best-known works are Mercury Teasing the Eagle of Jupiter, which is of bronze 9 feet high, which he made in Paris, a 7-foot statue of Solon, erected in the Congressional Library at Washington, busts of Franklin, Goethe, and Macaulay on the front of the same library, and the 11-foot statue of bronze of Victory for the Jamaica Soldiers and Sailors Monument. In competition, he won the contract for an equestrian statue of General John F. Hartranft, ex-governor of Pennsylvania, which he also made in Paris. It is considered the finest piece of work of its kind in America. Besides this labor, he has made a number of medallions and busts, and with the completion of his statue of Force, he will have made a wonderful record. Art was in me as a child, he said. I was discouraged whenever it beckoned me, but finally claimed me. I surrendered a good position to follow it, whether it led through a thorny road or not. A sculptor is an artist, a musician, a poet, a writer, a dramatist. To throw action, breath, and life, music and a soul into his creation. I can pick up an instrument and learn it instantly. I can sing and act, so I am in touch with the sympathies of the beings that I endeavor to create. You'll find most sculptors and artists of my composite nature. There, said Mr. Ruckstuhl, and he stretched out his arm with his palm downward and moved it through the air as he gazed into distance. You strive to create the imagination of your mind, and it comes to you as if sent from another world. You strive. That is the way to success. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of How They Succeeded. This is a LibriVox recording. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Chapter 9. Questions and Answers. Business Pointers by Darius Ogden Mills. What is your idea, Mr. Mills, of a successful life? If a boot-black does all the good he possibly can for his fellow men, his life has been just as successful as that of the millionaire who helps thousands. Mr. Mills was born in Western New York in 1825. He has been a leading financier for 50 years in California and in New York. He's connected with the management of 18 important business and philanthropic corporations in New York City. Work. What, Mr. Mills, do you consider the keynote of success? Work, he replied, quickly and emphatically. Work develops all the good there is in a man, idleness all the evil. Work sharpens all his faculties and makes him thrifty. Idleness makes him lazy and a spendthrift. Work surrounds a man with those whose habits are industrious and honest. In such society, a weak man develops strength, and a strong man is made stronger. Idleness, on the other hand, is apt to throw a man into the company of men whose object in life is usually the pursuit of unwholesome and demoralizing diversions. Self-dependence. To what formative influence do you attribute your material success, Mr. Mills? I asked. I was taught very early that I would have to depend entirely on myself, that my future lay in my own hands. I had that for a start, and it was a good one. I didn't waste any time thinking about succession to wealth, which so often acts as a drag upon young men. Many persons waste the best years of their life waiting for dead man's shoes, and when they get them, find them entirely too big to wear gracefully, simply because they have not developed themselves to wear them. As a rule, the small inheritance, which to a boy would seem large, has a tendency to lessen his efforts, and is a great damage to him in the way of acquiring the habits necessary to success. Habit of thrift. No one can acquire a fortune unless he makes a start, and the habit of thrift, which he learns in saving his first $100, is of inestimable value later on. It is not the money, but the habit which counts. There is no one so helpless as a man who is broke, no matter how capable he may be, and there is no habit so detrimental to his reputation among businessmen as that of borrowing small sums of money. This cannot be too emphatically impressed upon young men. Expensive habits. Smoking. Another thing is that none but the wealthy, and very few of them, can afford the indulgence of expensive habits. How much less, then, can a man with only a few dollars in his pocket? More young men are ruined by the expense of smoking than in any other way. The money thus laid out would make them independent, in many cases, or at least would give them a good start. A young man should be warned by the melancholy example of those who have been ruined by smoke, and avoid it. Forming an independent business judgment. What marked traits, Mr. Mills, have the influential men with whom you have been associated possessed, which most impressed you? A habit of thinking and acting for themselves. No end of people are ruined by taking the advice of others. This may answer temporarily, but in the long run it is sure to be disastrous. Any man who has an ability to judge for himself would better get a comfortable clerkship somewhere, letting some one of more ambition and ability do the thinking necessary to run the business. The multiplication of opportunities today in America. Are the opportunities for making money as numerous today as they were when you started in business? Yes. The progress of science and invention has increased the opportunities 1,000-fold, and a man can find them wherever he seeks them in the United States in particular. It has caused the field of employment of labor of all kinds to expand enormously, thus creating opportunities which never existed before. It is no longer necessary for a man to go to foreign countries or distant parts of his own country to make money. Opportunities come to him in every quarter. There is hardly a point in the country so obscure that it has not felt the revolutionizing influence of commercial enterprise. Probably railroads and electricity are the chief instruments in this respect. Other industries follow closely in their wake. Whereas one's best chance is the knowledge of men. In what part of the country do you think the best chances for young men may be found? The best place for a young man to make money is the town in which he was born and educated. There he learns all about everybody, and everybody learns about him. This is to his advantage if he bears a good character, and to the advantage of his townspeople if he bears a bad one. While a young man is growing up, he unconsciously absorbs a vast deal of knowledge of people and affairs, which would be equal to money if he only has the judgment to avail himself of it. A knowledge of men is the prime secret of business success. Upon reflection, how absurd it is for a man to leave a town where he knows everything and everybody, and go to some distant point where he doesn't know anything about anybody or anything, and expect to begin on an equal footing with the people there who are thoroughly acquainted. The bottom of the ladder. What lesson, Mr. Mills, do you consider it most needful for young men to learn? The lesson of humility, not in the sense of being servile or undignified, but in that of paying due respect to men who are their superiors in the way of experience, knowledge, and position. Such a lesson is akin to that of discipline. Members of the royal families in Europe are put in subordinate positions in the navies or armies of their respective countries, in order that they may receive the training necessary to qualify them to take command. They must first know how to obey if they would control others. In this country, it is customary for the sons of the presidents of great railroads or other companies to begin at the bottom of the ladder and work their way up step by step, just the same as any other boy in the employ of the corporation. This course has become imperatively necessary in the United States, where each great business has become a profession in itself. Most of the big machine shops number among their employees scions of old families who carry dinner pails and work with files or lathes, the same as anyone else. Such shoulder-to-shoulder experience is invaluable to a man who is destined to command, because he not only masters the trade technically, but learns all about the men he works with and qualifies himself to grapple with labor questions which may arise. There is no end of conspicuous examples of the wisdom of this system in America. There are also many instances of disaster to great industrial concerns due to the inexperience or the lack of tact of men placed suddenly in control. The beneficent use of capital. Upon this point, Mr. Mills said, "A man can, in the accumulation of a fortune, be just as great a benefactor of mankind as in the distribution of it. In organizing a great industry, one opens up fields of employment for a multitude of people who might otherwise be practically helpless, giving them not only a chance to earn a living for themselves and their families, but also to lay by a competency for old age. All honest, sober men, if they have half a chance, can do that, but only a small percentage can ever become rich. Now the rich man, having acquired his wealth, knows better how to manage it than those under him would, and having actual possession, he has the power to hold the community of his employees and their interests together, and prevent disintegration, which means disaster so much oftener to the employee than to the employer. The wholesome discipline of earning and spending. What is the responsibility of wealth, Mr. Mills? A man must learn not to think too much of money. It should be considered as a means and not an end, and the love for it should never be permitted to so warp a man's mind as to destroy his interest in progressive ideas. Making money is an education, and the wide experience thus acquired teaches a man discrimination in both men and projects where money is under consideration. Very few men who make their own money use it carelessly. Most good projects that fail owe their failure to bad business management rather than to lack of intrinsic merit. An inventor may have a very good thing, and plenty of capital may be enlisted, but if a man not acquainted with the peculiar line, or one who is not a good salesman or financier, be employed as manager, the result is disastrous. A man should spend his money in a way that tends to advance the best interests of society in the country he lives in, or in his own neighborhood at least. There is only one thing that is a greater harm to the community than a rich spendthrift, and that is a miser. Personal. A word about cheap hotels. How did you happen to establish the system of hotels which bears your name, Mr. Mills? I had been looking around for several years to find something to do that would be for the good of the community. My mind was largely on other matters, but it occurred to me that the hotel project was the best, and I immediately went to work at it. My purpose was to do the work on so large a scale that it would be appreciated and spread all over the country. For as the sources of education extend, we find more and more need of assisting men who have a disposition for decency and good citizenship. The mechanic is well paid, and the man who has learned to labor is much more independent than he who is prepared for a profession or scientific career or other objects in life that call for higher education. Clerks commencing at small salaries need good surroundings and economy to give themselves a start. Such are the men for whom the hotels were established. End of Chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of How They Succeeded. How They Succeeded by Orison Swett Marden. Nordica, What It Costs to Become a Queen of Song. Of the internationally famous singers, none is a greater favorite than Madame Lillian Nordica. She has had honors heaped upon her by every music-loving country, Milan, St. Petersburg, Paris, London, and New York in turn accepted her. Jewel cases filled with bracelets, necklaces, tiaras, and diadems of gold and precious stones attest to the unaffected sincerity of her admirers in all the great music centers of the world. She enjoys, in addition, the distinction of being one of the first 2 American women to attain to international fame as a singer in grand opera. Madame Nordica I met on appointment at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where she kindly detailed for me the difficulties she encountered at the outset. Distinction in the field of art is earned. It is not thrust upon anyone. The material for a great voice may be born in a person, it is, in fact, but the making of it into a great voice is a work of the most laborious character. In some countries, the atmosphere is not very favorable to beginners. Almost any of the greater European nations is probably better in this respect than the United States. Not much better, however, because nearly all depends upon strength of character, determination, and the will to work. If a girl has these, she will rise as high, in the end, anywhere. Madame Nordica came of New England stock, being born at Farmington, Maine, and reared in Boston. Her parents, bearing the name Norton, possessed no musical talent. Their opinion of music, said Madame, was that it is an airy, inviting art of the devil, used to tempt men's feet to stray from the solemn path of right. They believed music, as a vocation, to be nearly as reprehensible as a stage career, and for the latter they had no tolerance whatever. I might be just, though, and own that they did make an exception in the case of church music, else I should never have received the slightest encouragement in my aspirations. They considered music in churches to be permissible, even laudable, so when I displayed some ability as a singer, I was allowed to use it in behalf of religion, and I did. I joined the church choir and sang hymns about the house almost constantly. But I needed a world of training. I had no conception of what work lay ahead of anyone who contemplates singing perfectly. I had no idea of how high I might go myself. All I knew was that I could sing, and that I would win my way with my voice if I could. How did you accomplish it? By devoting all my time, all my thought, and all my energy to that one object. I devoured church music, all I could get hold of. I practiced new and difficult compositions all the time I could spare. I became a very good church singer, so much so that when there were church concerts or important religious ceremonies, I was always in demand. Then there began to be a social demand for my ability, and later, a public demand in the way of concerts. At first, I ignored all but church singing. My ambition ran higher than concert singing, and I knew my parents would not consent. I persuaded them to let me have my voice trained. This was not very difficult, because my church singing, as it had improved, became a source of considerable profit, and they saw even greater results for me in the large churches and in the religious field. So I went to a teacher of vocal culture, Professor John O'Neill, one of the instructors in the New England Conservatory of Music, Boston. He was a fine old teacher, a man of the highest ideals concerning music, and of the sternest and most exacting method. He made me feel at first that the world was mine if I would work. Hard work was his constant cry. There must be no play, no training for lower forms of public entertainment, no anything but study and practice. I must work and perfect myself in private, and then suddenly appear unheralded in the highest class of opera and take the world by storm. It was a fine fancy, but it would not have been possible. O'Neill was a fine musician. Under him I studied the physiology of the voice and practiced singing oratorios. I also took up Italian, familiarizing myself with the language, with all the songs and endless arias. In fact, I made myself as perfect in Italian as possible. In 3 years, I had been greatly improved. Mr. O'Neill, however, employed methods of making me work which discouraged me. He was a man who would magnify and storm over the slightest error and make light of or ignore the sincerest achievements. He put his grade of perfection so high that I began to consider it unattainable and lost heart. Finally, I gave it up and rested a while, uncertain of everything. After I thought a while and regained some confidence, I came to New York to see Madame Meretzik. She was not only a teacher, but also a singer quite famous in her day, and she thoroughly knew the world of music. She considered my voice to be of the right quality for the highest grade of operatic success, and gave me hope that, with a little more training, I could begin my career. She not only did that, but also sent me to studying the great operas, Lucia and the others, and introduced me to the American musical celebrities. Together, we heard whatever was worth hearing in New York. When the renowned Brignola came to New York, she took me to the Everett House, where he was stopping, and introduced me. They were good friends, and after gaining his opinion on the character of my voice, she had him play Faust. That was a wonderful thing for me, to hear the great Brignola. It fired my ambition. As I listened, I felt that I could also be great, and that people, some day, might listen to me as enraptured as I then was by him. It put new fire into me, and caused me to fairly toil over my studies. I would have given up all my hours if only I had been allowed or requested. So it went, until after several years of study, Madame Meretzik thought I was getting pretty well along and might venture some important public singing. We talked about different ways of appearing and what I would sing and so on, until finally Gilmore's band came to Madison Square Garden. He was in the heyday of his success then and carried important soloists with him. Madame Meretzik decided that she would take me to see him and get his opinion. And so one day, toward the very last of his Madison Square engagement, we went to see him. Madame Meretzik was on good terms with him also. I remember that she took me in one morning when he was rehearsing. I saw a stout, kindly, genial-looking man who was engaged in tapping for attention, calling certain individuals to notice certain points, and generally fluttering around over a dozen odds and ends. Madame Meretzik talked with him a little while, and then called his attention to me. He looked towards me. "Thinks she can sing, eh? Yes, well, all right. Let her come right along." Then he called to me. "Come right along now. Step right up here on the stage. Yes. Now what do you sing?" I told him I could sing almost anything in oratorio or opera if he wished. He said, Well, have a little from both. Now what shall it be?" I shall never forget his kindly way. He was like a good father, gentle and reassuring, and seemed really pleased to have me there and to hear me. I went up to the platform and told him that I would begin with "Let the Bright Seraphim," and he called the orchestra to order and had them accompany me. I was slightly nervous at first, but recovered my equanimity and sang up to my full limit of power. When I was through, he remarked, very good. And now, what else?" I next sang an aria from Sonnambula. He did not hesitate to express his approval, which was always, very good. Now what you want to do," he said, "is to get some roses in your cheeks and come along and sing for me." After that, he continued his conference with Madame Meretzik, and then we went away together. I was traveling on air when I left, I can assure you. His company was famous. Its engagement had been most successful. Madame Poppenheim was singing with it, and there were other famous names. There were only 2 more concerts to conclude his New York engagement, but he had told Madame Retzik that if I chose to come along and sing on these occasions, he would be glad to have me. I was more than glad of the opportunity and agreed to go. We arranged with him by letter, and when the evening came, I sang. My work made a distinct impression on the audience and pleased Mr. Gilmore wonderfully. After the second night, when all was over, he came to me and said, "Now, my dear, of course there is no more concert this summer, but I'm going west in the fall. Now, how would you like to go along?" I told him that I would like to go very much if it could be arranged, and after some negotiation, he agreed to pay the expenses of my mother and myself and gave me $100 a week besides. I accepted, and when the Western tour began, we went along. I gained thorough control of my nerves upon that tour and learned something of audiences and of what constitutes distinguished stage presence. I studied all the time, and with the broadening influence of travel, gained a great deal. At the end of the tour, my voice was more under my control than ever before, and I was a better singer all around. You did not begin with grand opera, after all? No, I did not. It was not a perfect conclusion of my dreams, but it was a great deal. My old instructor, Mr. O'Neill, took it worse than I did. He regarded my ambitions as having all come to naught. I remember that he wrote me a letter in which he thus called me to account. "After all my training, my advice that you should come to this, a whole lifetime of ambition and years of the hardest study consumed to fit you to go on the road with a brass band? Pah!" I pocketed the sarcasm in the best of humor, because I was sure of my dear old teacher's unwavering faith in me, and knew that he wrote only for my own good. Still, I felt that I was doing wisely in getting before the public, and so decided to wait quietly and see if time would not justify me. When the season was over, Mr. Gilmore came to me again. He was the most kindly man I ever knew. His manner was as gentle and his heart as good as could be. "I'm going to Europe," he said. "I'm going to London and Paris and Vienna and Rome, and all the other big cities. There will be a fine chance for you to see all those places and let Europeans hear you. They appreciate good singers. Now, little girl, do you want to come? If you do, you can." I talked it over with my mother and Madame Retzik and decided to go. And so, the next season, we were in Europe. We gave 78 concerts in England and France. We opened the Trocadero at Paris, and mine was the first voice of any kind to sing there. This European tour of the American band was a great and successful venture. American musicians still recall the furore which is created and the prestige which it gained at home. Mr. Gilmore was proud of his leading soloists. In Paris, where the great audiences went wild over my singing, he came to praise me personally in unmeasured terms. "My dear," he said, "you are going to be a great singer. You are going to be crowned in your own country yet. Mark my words. They are going to put diamonds on your brow." Madame Nordica had good occasion to recall this. In 1898, many years after, when her enthusiastic New York admirers crowned her with a diamond tiara as tribute of their admiration and appreciation. It was at the time when Gilmore was at the height of his Paris engagement that his agent ran off with his funds and left the old bandmaster almost stranded. Despite his sincere trouble, he retained his imperturbable good nature and came out of it successfully. He came to me one morning, smiling good-naturedly as usual. After greeting me and inquiring after my health, he said, "My dear child, you have saved some little money on this tour?" I told him I had. "Now, I would like to borrow that from you." I was very much surprised at the request, for he said nothing whatever of his loss. Still, he had been so uniformly kind and generous, and had won our confidence and regard so wholly, that I could not hesitate. I turned over nearly all I had, and he gathered it up and went away, simply thanking me. Of course, I heard of the defalcation later. It became generally known. Our salaries went right on, however, and in a few months the whole thing had been quite forgotten. When he came to me one morning with money ready in his hand, "To pay you for what I owe you, my dear," he said. "Oh yes," I said, "so and so much," naming the amount. "Here it is," he said, and handing me a roll of bills, he went away. Of course, I did not count it all until a little later, but when I did, I found just double the amount I had named, and no persuasion would ever induce him to accept a penny of it back. When did you part with Gilmore? At the end of that tour. He determined to return to America, and I had decided to spend some of my earnings on further study in Italy. Accordingly, I went to Milan and the singing teacher San Giovanni. On arriving there, I visited the old teacher and stated my object. I said that I wanted to sing in grand opera. "Why don't you sing in grand opera?" He answered, "Let me hear your voice." I sang an aria from Lucia, and when I was through, he said dryly, "You want to sing in grand opera?" "Yes." "Well, why don't you?" "I need training." "Nonsense," he answered. "We will attend to that. You need a few months to practice Italian methods, that is all." So I spent 3 months with him. After much preparation, I made my debut as Violetta in Verdi's opera La Traviata at the Teatro Grande in Brescia. The details of Madame Nordica's Italian appearance are very interesting. Her success was instantaneous. Her fame went up and down the land and across the water to her home. Next, she sang in Gounod's Faust at Geneva, and soon afterwards appeared at Navarro, singing Alice in Meyerbeer's Roberto, the enthusiastic and delighted subscribers presenting her with a handsome set of rubies and pearls. After that, she was engaged to sing at the Russian capital, and accordingly went to St. Petersburg, where in October 1881 she made her debut as La Felina in Mignon. There, also, her success was great. She was the favorite of the society of the court, and received pleasant attentions from every quarter. Presents were made her, and inducements for her continued presence until 2 winters had passed. Then she decided to revisit France and Paris. This was her crowning triumph. "I wanted to sing in grand opera at Paris," she said to me. "I wanted to know that I could appear successfully in that grand place. I counted my achievements nothing until I could do that." "And, did you?" "Yes, in July 1882, I appeared there." This was her greatest triumph, in the part of Marguerite. She took the house by storm and won from the composer the highest encomiums. Subsequently, she appeared with equal success as Ophélie, having been specially prepared for both these roles by the respective composers Charles Gounod and Ambroise Thomas. "You should have been satisfied after that," I said. "I was," she answered. "So thoroughly was I satisfied that soon afterwards I gave up my career and was married. For 2 years I remained away from the public, but after that time, my husband having died, I decided to return. I made my first appearance at the Burton Theatre in London and was doing well enough when Colonel Mapleson came to me. He was going to produce grand opera. In fact, he was going to open Covent Garden, which had been closed for a long time, with a big company. He was another interesting character. I found him to be generous and kind-hearted and happy-spirited as anyone could be. When he came to me, it was in the most friendly manner. "I'm going to open Covent Garden," he said. "Now here is your chance to sing there. All the great singers have appeared there. Patti, Gerster, Nielsen, Tietjens. Now it's your turn. Come and sing." "How about terms?" I asked. "Terms!" he exclaimed. "Terms! Don't let such a little detail stand in your way. What is money compared to this? Ignore money. Think of the honor, of the memories of the place, of what people think about it." And then he waved his arms dramatically. Yet we came to terms, not wholly sacrificial on my part, and the season began. Covent Gardens had not been open for a long time. It was in the spring of the year, cold and damp. There was a crowded house, though, because fashion accompanied the Prince of Wales there. He came night after night and heard the opera through with an overcoat on. It was no pleasant task for me, or healthy either, but the Lord has blessed me with a sound constitution. I sang my parts as they should be sung, some in bare arms and shoulders, with too little clothing for such a temperature. I nearly froze. But it was Covent Garden and a great London audience, and so I bore up under it. Things went on this way very successfully until Sir Augustus Harry took Drury Lane and decided to produce grand opera. He started in opposition to Colonel Mapleson, and so Covent Garden had to be given up. Mr. Harris had more money, more prestige with society, and Colonel Mapleson could not live under the division of patronage. When I saw the situation, I called on the new manager and talked with him concerning the next season. He was very proud and very condescending, and made sure to show his indifference to me. He told me all about the brilliant season he was planning, giving me a list of the great names he intended to charm with, and wound up by saying he would call on me in case of need, but thought he had all the celebrities he could use, but would let me know. Of course, I did not like that, but I knew I could rest a while, and so was not much disturbed. The time for the opening of the season arrived. The papers were full of accounts of the occasion, and there were plenty of remarks concerning my non-appearance. Then Aida was produced, and I read the criticisms of it with interest. She was indispensable in Aida. The same afternoon a message came for me. Would I come, and would I do so-and-so? I would, and did. I sang Aida, and then other parts, and gradually all the parts but one, which I had longed to try, but had not yet the opportunity given to me. I was very successful, and Sir Augustus was very friendly. The summer after that season, I visited Ems, where the Dereshkas were. One day they said, "We are going to Beirut to hear the music. Don't you want to go along?" I thought it over, and decided that I did. My mother and I packed up and departed. When I got there and saw those splendid performances, I was entranced. It was perfectly beautiful. Everything was arranged after an ideal fashion. I had a great desire to sing there, and boasted to my mother that I would. When I came away, I was fully determined to carry it out. Could you speak German? Not at all. I began, though, at once to study it, and when I could talk it sufficiently, I went to Beirut and saw Madame Wagner. The kindness of Frau Wagner. Did you find her the imperious old lady she is said to be? Not at all. She welcomed me most heartily, and when I told her that I had come to see if I could not sing there, she seemed much pleased. She treated me like a daughter, explained all that she was trying to do, and gave me a world of encouragement. Finally, I arranged to sing and create Elsa, after my own idea of it, during the season following the one then approaching. Meanwhile, I came to New York to fulfill my contract for the season of 1894 to 1895. While doing that, I made a study of Wagner's, and indeed of all German music, and when the season was over, went back and sang it. Madame Nordica has found her work very exacting. For it, she has needed a good physique, her manner of study sometimes calling for an extraordinary mental strain. I remember once, during my season under Augustus Harris, that he gave a garden party one Sunday, to which several of his company were invited, myself included. When the afternoon was well along, he came to me and said, "Did you ever sing Valencia in the Huguenots?" I told him I had not. "Do you think you could learn the music and sing it by next Saturday night?" I felt a little appalled at the question, but ventured to say that I could. I knew that hard work would do it. "Then do it," he replied, "for I must have you sing it." The Dereshkas, Jean and Edouard, were near at the time and offered to assist me. "Try it," they said, and so I agreed. We began rehearsals, almost without study, the very next day, both the Dereshkas prompting me, and by Friday they had me letter-perfect and ready to go on. Since the time seemed so peculiarly short, they feared for me, and during the performance stationed themselves one in either wing to reassure me. Whenever I approached near to either side of the stage, it was always to hear their repeated "Be calm," whispered so loud that the audience could almost hear it, yet I sang easily, never thinking of failure. Musical talent of American girls. "Let me ask you one thing," I said. "Has America good music material?" "As much as any other country and more, I should think. The higher average of intelligence here should yield a greater percentage of musical intelligence." "Then there ought to be a number of American women who could do good work of a high order?" "There ought to be, but it is a question whether there will be. They are not cut out for the work which it requires to develop a good voice. I have noticed that young women seem to underestimate the cost of distinction. It means more than most of them are prepared to give, and when they face the exactions of art, they falter and drop out. Hence, we have many middle-class singers, but few really powerful ones." "What are these exactions you speak of?" "Time, money, and loss of friends, of pleasure. To be a great singer means, first, to be a great student. To be a great student means that you have no time for balls and parties, very little for friends, and less for carriage rides and pleasant strolls. All that is really left is a shortened allowance of sleep, of time for meals, and time for exercise." The price of fame. Permanent recognition which cannot be taken away from you is acquired only by a lifetime of most earnest labor. People are never internationally recognized until they have reached middle life. Many persons gain notoriety young, but that goes as quickly as it comes. All true success is founded on real accomplishment acquired with difficulty. Many young people have genius, but they need training for valuable service. The world gives very little recognition for a great deal of labor paid in, and when I earn $1,000 for a half-hour's singing sometimes, it does not nearly average up for all the years and for the labor much more difficult which I contributed without recompense. End of Chapter 10.